So if all goes well, this class will be a good, it'll oscillate back and forth between being very superficial and maybe a little very in-depth, but my hope is that I can give people who don't really know the Machzor, they don't really know the prayer book of Rosh Hashanah well, that they'll get a basic understanding of it, and also to understanding a little bit what we're going to be doing in our service with the AAOM, and then someone who's not going to be with us, what they can sort of expect, or what they want to be looking for, or what they should do if they're having their own service. So what I have, the very first page, I tried to color coordinate this as best I could, but it's also a little small, so you might want to zoom in if you can't see so clearly, but there are the red, blue, green, orange, and purple. So those five different sections, 5 different parts to the Rosh Hashanah service. And the reality is that these 5 sections are pretty standard in even on a Shabbat morning. We're still going to hit these five sections, but I wanted to just color coordinate them just to make sure that they're clear. But this, I don't know if I mentioned, but this picture on the top of the page is from the Birnbaum Machzor that we have. And if you're working with an art scroll or a Koren or anything else, it's going to be the same basic structure. So the very first thing that's standard in all prayer books and all prayer services and morning prayers that we do in Judaism are these, what the table of contents here has is the preliminary morning service, the red arrow, which I'm calling on the bottom here, just preliminary blessings. These are standard, so Sunday through Saturday. It's always going to start with the same preliminary blessings. Those are recited always, every day. Not much to talk about over there. The blue arrow, Psukei de Zimra, and the Birnbaum, they already start calling that the morning service. Again, that's a pretty standard. It's going to look the same on any Shabbat or any holiday. It's going to look exactly the same on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So there's not much to say about that as for what we're going to talk about. The first thing that's where it's really going to be significant is the green arrow, which they call morning service for Rosh Hashanah. I'm calling in the green the Shacharit service, also known as the blessings of the Shema, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But the blessings of the Shema, this is the first part that looks, I wrote there, this is the first part that looks recognizably different without a minyan. What we've been doing in the AAOM on Saturday mornings, and what's happening with the students as well on Saturday mornings, is the red preliminary blessings and the blue Psukei de Zimra are being said on our own, and we're really only starting as a community together with the Shacharit service in the green, because that's the part where it's recognizably, noticeably looking very different than if it has a minyan, if there's no minyan. In theory, it's nice to have a minyan for all of these, the red and the blue, but the part that it becomes really, really important is the green. And so that's the first thing that I wanted to really focus on right now. And that's what we call the Shacharit service, or what I'm calling here the blessings of the Shema. Are people familiar with, if I say the blessings of the Shema, does that mean anything to anyone? People will know what that means when we talk about the blessings of the Shema.
Generally, yeah.
Yeah. So the general, for those who don't know, in general, the Shema that we say, the Torah says, when you wake up and when you go to sleep. So the Shema is said twice a day, once in the morning, once at night. And when it's said in the context of the prayer service, it is said, we bracket it on either end with blessings. In the morning, we have 2 blessings before reciting the Shema, 2 blessings after reciting the Shema. In the morning, it's 2 and 1. In the evening, it's 2 and 2. So this being the morning service is going to have 2 and 1. 2 blessings beforehand and 1 blessing afterwards. And that's going to be a lot of the things that we normally say on a typical Rosh Hashanah service. We spend a lot of time in these, what I call the introductory poems special to Rosh Hashanah that take place, if you have the Birnbaum Siddur, if you have a Machzor, if you have another one, it's on pages 169 to 185. These are things that are very flowery, very beautiful. I'm looking on page 175, for instance. If you look in the Machzor, you have the word in Hebrew melech, which means king, all over the place. And we add these liturgical poems, these introductory poems at this point in order to just sort of get into the mood of the day, that one of the themes we'll talk about later on. But one of the themes of Rosh Hashanah is God being king, God being sovereign. And so we have these liturgical poems that happen in the beginning. There are many congregations around the world that on a normal Rosh Hashanah omit them because they're just, I don't want to say they're just liturgical poems, but they don't have a significant amount of weight to them when compared to the actual blessings of the Shema. Our community normally does say them. In a year like this year, where we are not able to, where we're trying to minimize the amount of time that we're spending congregating together and having everyone outside wearing masks for the entire time, it can be very uncomfortable, very difficult. So we're trying to shorten things. So one of the first things that we're going to skip over and we're not going to say together are going to be these introductory poems that are special to Rosh Hashanah that span from page 169 until page 185. So far, so good with that?
Yep.
Anyone who's doing services on their own, or if you are a very, very quick Hebrew reader, there's no reason that one cannot say them. If we're at the AOM service and you're very quick in Hebrew, there's no reason not to say it if you really want to, or if you're on your own, there's no reason not to say it if there's no time restrictions. The reason would be that if we have to start cutting things off, these introductory poems between 169 and 185 are less significant in ranking of the liturgy than prayers that we say. Starting with pages 185 to 193 and then 195 to 201, those are standard and those are going to be said regardless. We're definitely going to be saying them in the AOM and you should say them on your own. And even if you're any day of the week, those are going to be the same. The two blessings before the Shema itself, and then the one blessing after the Shema up until page 201 in the Birnbaum Machzor. That's going to be standard and everyone should say that. And we're going to be saying that in the AOM service as well.
Jared, I'm
Yes.
in a different Machzor, so the page numbers are not the same. The portion you're talking about that follows the liturgical poems, is that beginning with Hameir?
Yes, that begins with Hameir.
Okay.
And then it sort of jumps back and forth. There are a couple more, but it starts with Hameir or Hakol Yoducha for Shabbat.
Right.
Page 183 or 185, at least in the Birnbaum that I have in front of me. And the difference between, with Michael's question, with the difference between Hakol Yoducha on page 185 and Hameir La'aretz is just a difference between on Shabbat and on a weekday. And now that's going to look exactly the same if you're just in like a regular weekday prayer book, like this standard Koran that we have. It's that chunk from 185 to 185 to 201 is going to look the same in any prayer book for any weekday or Shabbat prayer. It's those introductory poems, especially to Rosh Hashanah, that are going to be unique that unfortunately this year we're not going to be able to do. And that's going to be as usual until we get to, and then we start the silent Amidah. The silent Amidah is said all the time, every morning. The specific language shifts between weekday, holiday, Shabbat, or Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but we're going to say that, and everyone's going to say that starting on page 201 in the Birnbaum, and that ends on page 209. And that's the silent Amidah, recited everywhere, always. We're going to be saying that as well. What's going to be the first major, the thing that's significant is going to be the repetition of the Amidah. And on the first page, I say see below, so you can turn to page number 2 in this sheet. The repetition of the Amidah, into the green header. So it's going to look different day 1 and day 2 of Rosh Hashanah. They have slightly different liturgical poems. So that's why there are different pages that they give for those, because there are slightly different poems that are recited for them. The piece that's important to have with introduction is this source number 1, Nefesh Harav, was written by Rabbi Herschel Schachter of Yeshiva University, one of the major heads of Yeshiva University where I went to school. So he has the following in a book called Nefesh Harav. Literally, it means the soul of the rabbi. And so he wrote it in memory of Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, who was his own rabbi. And he wrote it, and he collected a lot of different traditions and practices of his rabbi, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, and put them in this book, Nefesh Harav. So in it, he writes the following in source number 1. Rosh Hashanah shechal b'chol. If you have a Rosh Hashanah that falls out on a weekday, he says, Asur lehafsik bein birkat hashofar legemar kol hatikiyot. He says, when you're talking about the after Shacharit service, but this is relevant in a minute, but after Shacharit is when we sound the shofar, we say a blessing over the shofar. So Rabbi Schechter says that it is forbidden to make an interrupting the blessings made on the shofar until after the final shofar blasts. That's everyone agrees to that. You shouldn't start schmoozing in the middle of the service when you're supposed to be listening to the shofar. Here's the unique thing that Rabbi Schechter points out. Hayamin hago shel hagrach, the practice of Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, who was the grandfather of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, Rabbi Schechter's own teacher. So Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik had the practice, shelo lomar shum piyutim, lerabot unatana tokef. He would say no liturgical poems, to include unatana tokef, which is like the big one that we say that, on Rosh Hashanah, our decree is written, and on Yom Kippur it's sealed, like that very powerful poem. He would omit all of that, chutz mehaochez biyad midat mishpat, except for one particular liturgical poem, because he says shehu meyusad al nusachot atikot shemit kufat hatanaim. He says Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik would omit all the liturgical poems of the Musaf service. We're talking about Shacharit right now, but he would omit all of the poems of the Musaf service except for one, that one that's called, starts with the word ha'ochez, because Rabbi Soloveitchik said that is one that's an ancient poem. Presumably what he's suggesting there is that all the other liturgical poems that are recited, both in the morning and in the afternoon, both in the Shacharit and Musaf, are newer. The ancient means approximately 200 CE, no later than 200 CE. And so he says that all the other ones are much later. So Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik and then Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik after would omit all those liturgical poems. On that basis, Rabbi Herschel Schachter wrote a responsa in source number 2, specifically about what to do during coronavirus. And he says, Le'ele shechosheshim b'shat ha'magefa lekatzer b'chol mai de'efshar b'tfilot shemitpalim biyachad. For those who are concerned because of the pandemic, to shorten services as much as possible when praying together, yesh lehashmit kol ha'piyutim shebechazrat hashatz. One may omit all of the liturgical poems of the repetition of the Amidah, of Yom Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And then in the future year, we'll return to normal. So Rabbi Schechter here is saying, so when we're talking about this repetition of the Amidah that's recited by the Shaliach Tzibur, by the leader of the service, Rabbi Schechter says, if you're in a situation where you've got to start omitting things, you can omit all of the liturgical poems because they're not essential. They're mostly later additions, and later additions in this case means only 1,000 years old as opposed to 2,000 years old. They're recent additions, and so if you have to start cutting things out, Rabbi Schechter would say, obviously we don't want to start cutting things out, but if we have to cut things out, maybe the liturgical poems should be the first things that we should cut out. Because of that, because of in our own community, we are going to be skipping quite a lot of the liturgical poems. What I have there on the bottom of the second page is in bold what we will be reciting, and in italics what we'll not be reciting. You'll notice that most on day 1, most of them are italicized, not really bolded. And on day 2, it's the same thing. Most is italicized. The minority is bolded. The parts that we do bold are ones that are either they speak a lot about God being king. And so when we're sort of choosing what to omit all of them might be a little more drastic than we need. So we're trying to keep some of the most essential ones that are about, that we focus on Rosh Hashanah, that specifically talk about God's kingship, because that's a that's a major theme and element of Rosh Hashanah. So we're going to keep as many of those as we can, but the rest of them we're unfortunately not going to be able to stay together. Now, a student asked me when I presented this list to the student services. So a student asked me, can they recite these? He's going to be respectful. They're not going to recite it during the service, but can they be recited after the service? And the answer is, sure, why not? They could be recited at any point. Someone who's saying their service on their own, they're not going to have a minyan. That person doesn't do the repetition. But if they decided to start going through and singing some of these poems, they absolutely can. There's no reason. I would say they're not obligated to. They don't have any responsibility to. It's not like if they left it out, then they missed part of the Rosh Hashanah prayer service that they would have to like do it again or something. But they're not required, and we'll come back to this theme, all this idea also when we get to the Musaf service in a little bit. But so that's Shacharit.
Jared,
Yes.
In between some of these piyutim that we're skipping are lines like Zochreinu L'chaim and Michamocha Avarachamim. Are those said?
Yeah, so those are going to be said. If you look, for instance, on page 213 is like something that you're looking at on page 213 in the Birnbaum. So it's those lines. What I gave for the piyutim and was specifically the Birnbaum Siddur is a little. It doesn't format it quite the same as something like the Art Scroll will, where the Art Scroll will sort of tell you, will sort of identify, this is a liturgical poem, this is not a liturgical poem. Things like Zochreinu L'chaim, Melech Ozer Moshiach Magen, Ata Gibor Le'olam on the bottom of page 213, those are all like part and parcel of the Amidah. Those are definitely going to be recited. It's the other things, like on the next page, 215, Ta'alat Zu Kechafetz Lahat'il, that's a poem that's going to be omitted. It's not as easy to discern. You're right. It's not as easy to discern in the Birnbaum here, but for instance, just to look at the Art Scroll so that people can sort of get a sense. The Art Scroll sort of changes the size of it. It might be hard to see, but it changes the size of the font. Up here is the main, and then it sort of shifts the size, new paragraph, sort of indented the lines, every other line indents. That's how Art Scroll identifies that it's a liturgical poem. And then that's the end of it, and then it jumps back up. The font is a little larger, and then it goes back. Font is a little smaller, and again, it starts indenting every other line to show it's a liturgical poem. It's a little easier in the Art Scroll. The Koran as well. I think they similarly will. All the liturgical poems have these slashes in the middle of them in the Hebrew, and if it doesn't have the slashes, it's not. So Birnbaum is not as it doesn't identify when you're dealing with the liturgical poem and when you're dealing with the actual essence of it. But yeah, Michael.
Jared, yeah, I just wanted to make sure I'm not misunderstanding. So the distinction between whether it's a piyut or whether it's actually part of the tefillah is important in both directions, because if you are davening with a minyan, you are allowed to skip the piyutim, but you should not skip the tefillah, right?
Correct.
And if you're davening by yourself, it's the other way around. You're allowed to include the piyutim if you want to, but you should not include the tefillah because you don't do a repetition without a minyan.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. Yes. That's a very good, a very good. Yeah, it works in both directions. Said perfectly. If you're in the service with a minyan and you're looking to skip, then if it's part of the Amidah, you should not. If it's part of the Amidah, you must say it. If it's not part of the Amidah, you can skip it. And then the exact opposite, if you're on your own, where you're not doing the repetition, if it's part and parcel of the Amidah, you should not say it. But if it's, I don't want to say if it's just a liturgical poem that is not part of the Amidah itself, then it may be recited. Exactly. Said perfectly. Yeah.
Rabbi, could we go back just a little bit to, maybe I just didn't comprehend well enough, the source for your source number 2.
Yeah.
Could you just tell me a little bit more about who that is? And is this the way most people are holding? Or?
This is the way most modern Orthodox synagogues are doing this year, is following this guidance. Now, not everyone is going to be skipping, but in a community that's, there are two reasons that people are skipping from talking with my rabbinic colleagues. One reason that people are skipping is the reason that we're skipping, which is that it could be very uncomfortable to have people there for so long wearing masks. The idea of expecting people to stay for 3-4 hours wearing masks outside, when who knows what the weather is going to be, it's very challenging, and to make that request is maybe puts an undue pressure. That's one reason that people are talking about skipping. Another reason that people are talking about skipping is you have some communities where they have one parking lot outside they're going to do service, and they have 200 people that want to come, and they can only fit 100 people in the tent. So they have 200 people coming, only 100 at a time, so they're doing shifts. So you have shift number 1 from 6 to 8, and shift number 2 from 8:30 to 10. And so they're shortening, not necessarily because, it could also be because of general COVID, but it also could be because in practice, they don't have a space large enough, so they have to start cutting things out in order to fit 2 services in a slot that would normally be 1. So that's Rabbi Herschel Schachter's point here is fairly standard among modern Orthodox congregations. I can't speak to congregations further to the right. I'm not sure what they're going to be doing, but I think in the modern Orthodox, centrist Orthodox, open Orthodox, liberal Orthodox, traditional Orthodox, however you want to put it, the mainstream modern Orthodox approach is going to be following this, is going to be cutting out, if they need to, cutting out those liturgical poems. That's Rabbi Herschel Schachter has very broad shoulders and carries a lot of weight in the modern Orthodox world. Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, who he's referring to in source number 1, also carries a lot of weight. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik also carries a lot of weight. So these are 3 very, very significant and influential rabbis in the modern Orthodox community that I would be surprised if there's a modern Orthodox community who's not at least entertaining this. They might say, we don't need to shorten, so we're not going to shorten. But if anyone's entertaining shortening, they're thinking about this.
So what you're saying is that this is a very well-respected posek that almost everybody is following. So it's also representative of what everybody's doing, but it's because of the...
Yes. Yeah. Again, now, and I don't know. I haven't had a conversation with Rabbi Goldstein at the Chabad house. I'm not sure. Rabbi Goldstein would probably not look at Rabbi Schachter and say, that's an authority that I'm going to follow. But it could be that in the Chabad world, they're also having these conversations, but Rabbi Schachter is not going to have much weight in the Chabad world, just like any Chabad leader is not going to have much weight for what we do. I'm going to follow the modern Orthodox community. But this, as I said, I think this is going to be pretty, people might not necessarily quote Rabbi Schachter on this, because there's already a general recognition that we know these poems. Anyone who knows, I don't know enough history of them, but if you look at the prayer book and you see that 365, or not 365 days a year, but 360 days a year, 363 days a year, we have a specific formula that it normally looks like. And then on Rosh Hashanah, we have that formula, plus we add a little bit more. So everyone's going to say, okay, but that thing that we added is really just an addition. So it's not, Rabbi Schachter's argument is not based on any like early source. It's just based on his general understanding and his own teacher's understanding of significance of these poems, history of these poems, because there was a time when no one would say these poems because these poems hadn't been written yet. So that tells you something about how significant, how important it is to say them if they weren't always in existence. We'll see later on, like when it comes to Musaf, there are parts of Musaf that have, as long as there has been organized Jewish prayer in Rosh Hashanah, there have been parts that have been said. And so there's no question we're going to skip those. We're not going to skip them because those were always there. But these liturgical poems, they haven't always been there. So if we can't say them, okay. It was good enough 1,500 years ago. It's good enough now. But yeah, that's a good question.
Thanks.
Looking back on page number 1, after the repetition of the Amidah, we're going to go into Torah reading. Torah reading on Rosh Hashanah and on Yom Kippur. And this is, by the way, also true this is laid out right here for Rosh Hashanah, but I can share with anyone who's interested in advance. I can share with you what we will be saying and what we won't be saying on Yom Kippur. And again, it's going to look similarly. It's going to look similar. Most are going to be skipped. Certain important points are going to be said, but most is going to be skipped for Yom Kippur. But for the Torah reading is going to be a standard Torah reading. Someone who's praying on their own doesn't have to take out a Torah scroll and read it. Maybe, according to some opinions, it maybe would be inappropriate for a person, even if they owned a Sefer Torah, to start pulling it out and modeling a public Torah reading, because Torah reading is something that is generally reserved for the reading from a scroll is something that's generally reserved for it's a communal mitzvah. And so maybe someone who has their own Torah scroll should not open it up and start reading publicly, but most people aren't going to have just a Sefer Torah sitting around in their house. And someone who wants to sit and read and chant out of a Siddur or out of a Chumash, the Torah reading, definitely should. I don't know if we could say that it's obligatory. Someone who's not in shul, who doesn't have a Chumash or doesn't want to do the Torah reading on his or her own, I don't think would say it has to, but it's certainly part of the service that someone who's going to want to say should definitely feel empowered to say, and that'll be the Torah reading and then the Haftorah after that, which I didn't put the pages on in the Birnbaum, but it's somewhere in the late 200s, early 300s in the Birnbaum as to where Torah reading is going to be. The AAOM service, what it's looking like, is going to look very similar to what we're doing with the Shabbat services, that the person doing the reading is going to accept the Aliyah. That's going to allow for social distancing, and that's going to allow for social distancing. People aren't going to be passing the Torah scroll back and forth. There's not going to be multiple hands. So that's what we're planning on doing for the AAOM Torah service, is to do it similarly that we're doing on Shabbat, where one person reads and he will take the aliyot as well. Any questions on the Torah reading section before we move on to shofar? So shofar is the next most significant piece. That's in the orange on page number 1. So shofar is, and I'm going to give a class, I think it's next week, on why we do these 30 blasts of the shofar. So I'm not going to go in depth into it right now, but the basic practice is to do these 30 different blasts. There's the tekiyah. As you'll notice in each of those lines, on either end, there's a tekiyah on the beginning, tekiyah on the end, and then something in the middle. So the first round is the tekiyah, which is the solid toot. Then there's the shvarim trua, which is going to be the toot, 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 toot. And then tekiyah at the end. We're going to do that 3 times. Then immediately after that is going to be tekiyah, shvarim tekiyah, toot, 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 3 times. And then the last one, tekiyah trua tekiyah, toot, 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 toot at the end. You count all those up. You've got a total of 30 blasts that are going to happen there. That's going to happen whether you're, well, we'll get to whether you're at home on your own in a minute, but in the AOM service, we're going to be doing that and those 30 blasts as standard. There's, and this is before performing the mitzvah of shofar is a blessing, and that's what Rabbi Schechter in source number 1 on page 2 was alluding to, was the blessing that happens before the shofar. There's a shofar that's going to be sounded again during the repetition of the Amidah in the purple. And then even after that, there's going to be more shofar. So we'll get to that in a minute, but these shofar blasts are going to happen in the AOM service. Someone who's not going to be in the AOM service doing a service on their own, this part, we're going to see a source in a little bit, but this should probably be done even if someone's on their own, if they have a shofar at their disposal. If they don't have a shofar on their disposal, then they obviously won't do this. And the AOM is going to host a later shofar service for people who can't hear it in the service or they're at home. We're going to do it later on so people can hear those 30 shofar blasts. Those 30 shofar blasts are the fulfillment of a biblical commandment to hear the shofar. Next week, we'll talk about why it's so many to fulfill this mitzvah and some of the theological problems with this idea, but we'll get to that next week. But this is going to be crucial. If someone does nothing at all on Rosh Hashanah, if they do one thing on Rosh Hashanah, it should be this. Last year, a member of the Ann Arbor Orthodox Minyan was telling me that as a doctor, they had to choose, they could get one day off, or it was one day off for high holiday services, should this person choose to take off for Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. And the person instinctively thought they should take off for Yom Kippur because it's Yom Kippur, it's such a big day. But the answer, in fact, is that it should be Rosh Hashanah, because Rosh Hashanah, shofar is something that you cannot do. I mean, if someone has their own shofar on their own, then good. But if you're going to be in the hospital working all day, you're not going to have an opportunity to hear shofar. You could take off either Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, or take off Rosh Hashanah, you can hear shofar, and you'll be able to fulfill that mitzvah. So shofar is crucial. If you don't hear it here, then you should definitely come to hear it at the later on shofar service that we're going to do later on in the day on Rosh Hashanah. And that's the shofar service. Any questions on that before we move on to the Musaf? Right,
so I dropped out for a minute, and I'm sorry, and came back in. You may have answered this already, but are there any parts of the shofar service that require a minyan?
None of these require a minyan. This part doesn't require a minyan. This should be done whether you're on your own or whether you're with 1,000 people. The shofar service is going to look exactly the same. Now, there's a little bit, yeah.
And just to fulfill the mitzvah of hearing the shofar, do you need to hear all 30 blasts, or is like one good tekiah enough to be yotzei?
You're going to need to hear all 30 blasts. We're going to talk more about that why next week. The short answer is that at some point during these 30 blasts, you are fulfilling your biblical commandment to hear the shofar. We don't know which one of these it is, so we do all three times. That poses significant theological problems, which we're going to talk about next week. But that's why these 30. If you do only 3 of them, if you do one of these 3 times, or you may not have fulfilled the mitzvah. We'll talk more about that next week. But yeah, you're going to have to do all 30. But no, one is not required to hear any more than this. We're gonna talk a little bit more about that in the Musaf section. Because the shofar is blown again during the repetition of Musaf, which we'll get to, but it's not required. And if someone's only going to hear shofar, they're only going to be able to hear shofar at one point. This is the point to hear it. This is when one fulfills the obligation. And if one is at home in bed and they can't do anything, and they are not going to be praying anything, going to be doing anything, the person should be able to hear these 30 blasts is the most important. Following shofar is
we do this Lam Natseach, Livnei Korach, Mizmor. Yeah, it says 7 times.
Yeah, so we're it's a psalm.
Yeah.
Why 7 times? It probably has some sort of mystical significance. The AOM it may be the Chazin's choice, but we'll probably not say it 7 times out loud. Yeah. We may say it 7 times quietly. Rabbi Schechter in that piece that I quoted in source number 2, he also writes that you could say it 7 times, you could say it once, you could skip it entirely. It's a nice thing, but it's not required. It's not like the blessings. So one who wants to say it could certainly say it. The responsive thing at the bottom of page 351 that's down here. These are it's Karas Satan, Min HaMeitzar. Yeah, that's that can be said, that should be said. Does it need to be said? If it's going to be cut out, we're gonna say it. It doesn't take that long. But one who's not able to, if what happens if someone's has 5 minutes, they can do only one thing. 5 minutes, jump right into the tekiyot, say the blessings, and then jump right in. Yeah, good. That's a good question. And then the Torah is returned, and then we move into the Musaf prayer. I didn't put it on this sheet, but on this source sheet, but if people are familiar with, on page 325 is this called Reader's Meditation, which starts Hineni He'ani, poor in worthy deeds I am, or really, behold I don't know, the English translation I didn't really translate well. Hineni He'ani Mima'as, here I am, poor of anything worthwhile that I have done. That is a beautiful, beautiful service. It's not really that important. as far as the service that we're going to say. What I told the people who are going to be leading Musaf is that it's up to them to say it or not. Ultimately, this is a prayer that is said by the leader on behalf of himself, asking God to help him recite the prayers of Musaf. And so I wasn't going to tell anyone that they shouldn't say it, meaning if whoever's going to be leading Musaf, if Jonathan Warsh wants to say a prayer on his behalf to God, who am I to say you shouldn't say it? So I said, if you're going to say it, but I ask that you say it quickly and quietly. Oftentimes, Professor Gittleman would read it, the parts out loud, parts quietly, but slowly, quickly. And I said, if you want to say it this year, I ask that you say it quietly and quickly to yourself. But I couldn't tell someone not to say it because if there's one prayer that the Chazan, the leader, should be able to say, it's the leader praying for himself. So it's a beautiful service also, and it's really asking God for the help and support to be able to lead the congregation in the Musaf service. The silent Amidah here, looking at the purple, starts on page 327, ends on page 347. There are a couple parts to it that are important. Source number 1 on page 3. We could sort of skip over this source, but these are just a source from the Vayikra, book of Leviticus, that talks about how you should sound the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. It doesn't make any mention of how many times to sound the shofar. It doesn't make any mention of what should be said liturgically on Rosh Hashanah. It just says you should sound the shofar. Nonetheless, in source number 2, the Talmud quotes the following idea. The sages taught in a Braita, in an early source, the various trumpet blasts on a fast day do not invalidate one another, etc., etc., etc. Skipping to the last line there in the English. However, the shofar blasts and additional blessings of Rosh Hashanah and of Yom Kippur do invalidate one another, meaning you have to say all of them. It's not like you can do some but not others. You got to do all of them. If you don't do all of them, you haven't done anything. What's the reason? The Gemara asks, what's the reason that all the blasts and blessings are indispensable on Rosh Hashanah? Rabbah said, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, recite before me on Rosh Hashanah kingship, remembrances, and shofarot. Literally, shofarot would be, shofars, trumpets. Kingship, so that you will crown me as king over you. Remembrances, so that your remembrance will rise before me for good. And with what? With the shofar. Since these blessings constitute a single unit, one who did not recite them all has not fulfilled his obligation. That means you have to recite the blessings related to kingship, remembrances, and shofars. And you have to say the blessings, and you have to sound the shofar 3 times corresponding to each one of these: kingship, remembrances, and shofars. And so that's where we get the basic, the framework of the Musaf service. There are 3 major sections to the Musaf service. One is the Malchiyot kingship section. One is and this I laid out on the bottom of page 4 onto page 5. One is the Malchiyot section, the kingship section. One is the remembrances section, the Zichronot section. And the last one is the Shofaret section, the trumpet section. We can skip source number 3 for the time being, but if we go to source number 4, and source number 4 is a Mishnah in Masachet Rosh Hashanah, which sort of details the structure of the Musaf service. And if you look at it, you see that it sort of lays out there what the service should look like. You say the patriarchs, the powers, sanctification of the name, which is standard in all services. And then includes kingship verses. This is the first opinion, which we don't follow. But the order here it's not even, you can look at that on your own. It's not even that crucial for the point here that I'm making, other than you see that already this idea of Malchiyot, Zichron, and Shofarot, mentioning God's kingship, mentioning God's memory, Zichron, and mentioning the shofar, are ancient. They're 2,000-year-olds at least, that they're said as part of the Rosh Hashanah service. And so those are not going to be skipped in any way, shape, or form out of anything that's done for Musaf, whether you're on your own, whether you're with the AUM, wherever you are, they're going to be said. If you look at sort of the bottom half of the page on page 4, we have the structure of again, there are liturgical poems in this, and you'll see I put what we're going to be saying and what we're not going to be saying. The Musaf service on day 1 is a little longer, as you can see on day 2. There are 14 steps to day 1. Some of them said, some of them not said, and only 8 on day 2. And you'll see that most of what we're going to be saying on day 2, we're going to be saying most things, and we're going to be skipping, maybe, I don't know, count it out, but half of the things we're going to be skipping on day 1. And again, the same rubric that we chose for the Shacharit service, what poems we say, what poems we don't say, is the same here. Things that are crucial to the liturgy, like on day 1, number 10, Ubechen 10 Pachtecha, is part and parcel of the Amidah that can't be skipped. But number 4, like Af Orach, is just a nice poem. We're gonna skip that. Something like Unatana Tokef, point number 7 on day 1. Unatana Tokef is something that maybe it could be skipped. Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik would skip it, but that's something that has such a hold on Jewish worship. The idea on Rosh Hashanah, our deeds are written, our decree is written. On Yom Kippur, it's sealed. That's so major to so many people that many couldn't imagine not saying Unatana Tokef. And so that we're going to be saying, but a lot of the other services, a lot of the other poems we're going to be skipping. And it's the same deal as Michael pointed out for Shacharit, and same deal here. These liturgical poems, you want to say them, great. You don't want to say them on your own, that's fine. But if you're going to be saying it, if it's just a poem, then it could be skipped by the minyan and not recited by an individual. And the reverse, if the things that are part and parcel of the Amidah, like Uvechen ten Pachtecha, that shouldn't be said. That's number 11 on day 1, or sorry, that's number 10 on day 1. That should not be said by an individual, but it would not. I'm sorry, it should not be said by an individual, but it definitely should be said by the communal during the repetition of the Amidah. If that distinction makes sense. The same point that Michael raised about Shacharit is the same one that's going to be for the repetition of the Musaf.
And just to make sure I'm clear on that, Unatana Tokef is in which category? That's a piyut, or is part of the tefillah?
So for your question, Unatana Tokef is a piyut. I can send you a better layout for someone who's going to be on their own and wants to know clearly the difference. Unatana Tokef is a piyut. And same for Misod, number 1. They're piyutim that are very important piyutim, so we're going to be saying them. So don't, Michael or anyone who's going to be on their own, there will be when we post this recording and this source sheet on the website, I'll post with it the what parts are piyutim and what are not piyutim, so that you can have a very user-friendly what you can say, what not to say if you're going to be on your own, because this was written up for the Chazan with the minyan, so don't necessarily follow this, because that's a good point that I didn't think of. Something like Unatana Tokef, which we will be saying, anyone can say, because that's not part and parcel. So thank you for pointing that out, because I didn't make that clear the first time.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, I don't want to derail the conversation, but I was just thinking about the fact that, in addition to the halachic aspects, there's also kind of the aesthetic aspects of the holidays, right? Like there's certain melodies and certain aspects of the service. If you don't do them, it doesn't feel like you're doing the service.
Right. And
that's
Unatana Tokef.
Line is very important.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. And that Unatana Tokef is a perfect example. That's a poem. That's the aesthetic thing that if you were to skip it, like it's not Rosh Hashanah, so you have to say Unatana Tokef. But as you said, we're saying that because how could we not say it? We're not saying it because we need to say it.
Right.
That's an important distinction. Thank you.
Thank you.
The last piece to say, in source number 5, is the Shulchan Aruch writes the following: Yachid eino mafsik litkoa bebrachot. An individual who's praying on his or her own, who's not going to be doing a repetition of the Amidah. During the repetition of the Amidah is when we sound the shofar a second time. If you're praying on your own, there's not going to be a repetition, so there's no sounding of the shofar then. So the Shulchan Aruch authority rules they should not pause in the middle of their silent Amidah to repeat to sound the shofar. And the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, he writes, rather they sound shofar before Musaf, and there is no need to sound it a second time. And so it sounds from what the Ramah is saying that someone who's praying on their own should make sure to hit those 30 during the shofar, during that orange section, and that's it. They don't need to. So the language here might be tricky. The Rama says ein srichim. That person doesn't need to sound it again. It seems from that language that it's permitted. The person can certainly sound the shofar any point they want during the day in Rosh Hashanah. You could sound it however you want. You can sound the shofar. But I think Rabbi Moshe Isser is pointing out that it's not necessary. If someone's going to start reciting these piyutim later on and wants to recite the elements of how God's a king, and those, I didn't put that here, but I should say that the Malchiot section, the Zichronot section, the Shofarot section, that's on the bottom of 4, top of 5, those sections are just biblical verses. Not just, but those are biblical verses. Whether you're with the minyan or whether you're not with the minyan, one could certainly say those. One is going to say them individually during the silent Amidah. So if one wants to repeat them again and sound the shofar after saying them, one certainly can. But there's no responsibility to. And so I think many people would probably, following the point of the Ramah here, would say, okay, I'm not gonna sound it a second time. We did the 30 blasts. We fulfilled the obligation. The only reason that in the congregation we sound it again is because we think that there may be an additional merit to sounding the shofar an additional 30 times, but it's not required. If that makes sense. So even on the AOM, we're going to sound it an additional time during the repetition, but it's someone who's on their own shouldn't feel like they have to. And that's the Musaf. That's the Musaf section, and then that goes until that finishes, and then there are the concluding prayers, like the Ein Kelokeinu and Aleinu and things like that are those concluding prayers. With the AOM, we're going to sound the shofar an additional 40 times. After that, in order to catch a total of 100 shofar blasts, 30 the first time, 30 the second time in the repetition, and then in the last 40 blasts. I'm 90%, I shouldn't say 90, I'm 85% sure that we're going to do an additional 40 because there's a very old custom of sounding the shofar 100 times. We'll talk a little bit about that next week. There's an old custom of sounding it 100 times, but if there's ever something that's just a custom and a year like this year where it's someone's on their own, they're not going to be able to sound the shofar 100 times, that could very easily be done away with. It's a custom. It's a nice idea. There's all the symbolism around the 100 times. 100 is a nice round number, but it's not necessary in any way. So what we're going to be doing the AOM, we'll likely do it in order to capture those last 40, and it doesn't take that much longer. Maybe what we'll do is we'll let people leave, and if people want to stay to hear those last 40, they can, but not hold people there. But when we repeat the shofar again later on in the afternoon for people who weren't able to be at the service, we're just going to do 30. We're not going to do 60. We're not going to do 100. We're just going to do those 30 because that's really all that's necessary. And that's the final shofar blasts of the concluding prayers. And that's it. The AOM service is going to last a little bit longer than the typical Shabbat service that we've been doing right now, but it's certainly not going to last as long as it normally does. It's going to be moving quickly. There's not going to be much, if any, singing. A lot of these liturgical poems are just going to be skipped, and we're going to move through it. One of my rabbis pointed out that the Talmud in Masechet Brachot, the Talmud says that there are two reasons. The basis of our prayers are on two bases. One opinion is it's based on the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There are lines in the Torah that describe Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob praying. And so it's our prayer services that we do are based off of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and this sort of spontaneous prayer. But the Talmud also says that our prayer service is based on the sacrifices in the temple, sacrifices in the Beit HaMikdash, sacrifices in the Mishkan, which is very rigid and set. And a sacrifice, you have what you're supposed to do, you have to do it, and then you stop, and that's it. It's not spontaneous, it's very planned out. And when my rabbi pointed out that we try to have both normally. We try to have, okay, there's a set prayer. We say this liturgy, we say this line, we don't say this line. It's set like a sacrificial offering. But we also try to keep it spontaneous and fresh and exciting and meaningful. And this year, unfortunately, because of coronavirus, we may be leaning more on the side of what do we need to say, what do we not need to say. We're going to say what we need to say. We're not going to say what we don't need to say. and we're not going to be able to spend the time singing and closing our eyes and getting really into the prayer service that we normally would. But unfortunately, we're going to have to rely a little more heavily this year on the basis of our prayers on sacrifices, and less so on the beautiful, inspirational, spiritual spontaneity that we normally strive for. It's not going to be easy. This is no one ever wants to have to start going through the hierarchy of what can be said, what can be skipped, what should be skipped. But this year is a year unlike any others. I hope this was helpful in giving a little bit of a frame. I don't know, Kathy, if that was like a half hand raise or a fly flying in your face.
But please finish, because it's
No, but I was just going to sum up and say that hopefully this gives a little more of an idea as to what we're going to be doing in the AAOM, and someone who's going to be on their own, what they would say. And hopefully this will help make the service, whether you're with the AAOM or you're not with the AAOM, make it a little more meaningful when you, at least, or easier, when you know what you're doing and sort of have the map of where you're going and what's being said. I think it's that much easier to really feel it, instead of just looking at pages, how many pages do we have left, but to know where we're going. I think, at least for me personally, makes things a little more meaningful when I have the map of where we're going, and hopefully this will be helpful for everyone here as well. Kathy, yeah, you had a question.
Oh, well, we have been doing a little bit of research, but it'd be great to have your guidance. So the question that we have is, with people being more alone, so people cannot be yotze for a woman playing shofar, because Doraisa is understood to be a time-bound commandment, even though the rest of us don't do it. That's right? Is that?
Yeah. Mitzvah aseh she'azman grama. Yeah.
Okay, so but let's say a woman is on her own and she could play shofar, then that's fine. If there are other women in the household, that's also fine. If there's a man who can't play shofar, he's out of luck, because he cannot be. I'm serious.
No, I would want to double check, but yeah, I believe so. I mean, listen, we the general practice of Ashkenazim is that we encourage women to do time-bound positive mitzvot, and for Ashkenazim, women say brachot on time-bound positive mitzvot. So we'd certainly encourage it, and but yeah, no, I think you're correct.
So if, let's just say Ariel and Evan. So let's say there's no way Evan can fetch it out, right? And she's a trumpet player, and she can, but so she's fine, she can do it for herself, but he's just hasn't been able to fulfill the mitzvah. Is that the way it works?
Yeah, I think so. He should come to the park and hear it there, or start practicing now.
But there really may be people in circumstances like that. It's interesting.
Jared, can I?
Yeah.
This is probably not the forum for a halachic debate, but I have a question about that argument, right? So,
okay.
My
Well, so let me. I'll stop the recording and move on, and then people can leave if they want to leave, and we'll go from there.